It's fair to say that I have never been the biggest fan of using a hoop or frame when I cross stitch, but I also never say never, and when I got the opportunity to try out one of these newer Nurge hoops, which I'd heard great things about, I thought I'd give it a go. Hi there Stitchy friends, I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your cross stitching. Now, I'm going to be referencing a couple of other videos that I've made during this one today, so whenever I do that, you'll see I will pop a link up in a card up there for you, and also I will list them all in the description. So today I am back on my favourite and sometimes controversial topic of hoops. As I've said, I've never been the biggest user of hoops, well not at all really, because I just prefer to stitch in hand. And if you're curious to know more about that, then go and take a look at the video I made talking about the pros and cons of hoops. To set the scene briefly for today though, the main reasons that I haven't been too fond of using hoops is that I don't love the creases that they can leave in the fabric. I don't really love the idea of having them be over completed stitches and potentially squashing those stitches. And I've just found them really awkward to hold. I've also always been happy with the tension that I can achieve when stitching in hand, so haven't really felt the need for a hoop in that regard. But when I had, as I say, one of these Nurge hoops gifted to me, I thought it was a really great opportunity to try it out. It's always worth trying a hoop again and see if maybe this was the one that could convince me to love hoops. And it has lots to recommend it. Now, I rather like the rectangular shape because it feels like it gives you more real estate in terms of fabric to work on compared with a circle, although I guess that might depend what shape your pattern is. The construction works just like a hoop, having an inner and an outer part that fit together and tighten with a screw. But it also has a notch in the outer part, which snaps into a groove in the inner part. And this holds the fabric really securely, and I definitely didn't find the fabric slipping at all when I was using it. I also like that the screw to tighten it is at the top and angled, so it's really easy to get hold of and to use. Now there are 4 sizes available in this hoop, and I have the 3rd largest, so this is the number 3 hoop. It's quite a big size at 22 by 19.5 centimetres. But there is an even bigger size and 2 smaller sizes. So what was my verdict? Well, I tried this out with a brand new start, and I'll show you, here's my stitching in the hoop. And this is a pattern from Soda Stitch. It's called the Coffee Gnome, so I will link that in the description in case you're interested in taking a look at that. And I thought this would be a really good test because if I bring this in, you can maybe see I'm stitching this on linen. And that's notoriously more difficult to get a nice even tension than with Aida. So I thought this would be a really good test for the hoop to see if it made it easier to stitch on. Now I definitely liked how lightweight the hoop was, but because of its size, I did find that it was still a little bit awkward to hold with one hand. I ended up having to kind of rest it. I held one hand holding the corner and rested the end of it kind of on my chest as I stitched. Or I could rest this end on my knee as I was stitching. So I kind of had to find a way to make it work to be able to hold it. And it was okay, but slightly less than ideal. Now, if I was using one of the smaller size hoops, I think that wouldn't really have been such a problem. But then it would have thrown up another problem, which for me is actually even worse. And that's the risk of squashing your stitches. If you're using a hoop that you could fit all of your design in, then you won't have to move the hoop around, and you won't at any point have to put the hoop over completed stitches which could potentially squash them. Now, I know a lot of cross stitchers do this and say it really doesn't cause a problem, the stitches will be absolutely fine at the end, but I just don't really want to take the risk. So I think if I were to use a hoop more regularly, then I would be looking for one that I could fit the whole of my design in, and I would then invest in a clamp stand that I could put the hoop in, so that then I wouldn't have to try and balance it anywhere. Now there would still be the other issue that I've mentioned that I don't love very much with hoops, which is that they will put some creases in your fabric, and they can sometimes be quite tricky to remove at the end. This can be mitigated somewhat by taking your stitching out of the hoop after every stitching session. And as I say, if I went for a large enough hoop that the whole design fits in and any hoop creases would be outside the visible finished area, then that also wouldn't be a problem. Now, in terms of actually how it felt to stitch with my fabric in the hoop, I actually found it really quite nice to use. It definitely did with the linen open up the holes, they were nice and easy to find. So yeah, I actually really quite enjoyed stitching with it in the hoop. However, I then took the hoop off and carried on stitching, and it wasn't really that much different. So the benefit on how easy it is to stitch is really marginal. For me at least, anyway. I didn't really notice any difference in the neatness of my stitches, with or without the hoop, although I do like to railroad at least the top arm of my cross stitches, and I found this quite hard to do with the hoop. But again, if I had the hoop in a clamp frame to hold it, then I think that would be a lot easier. And if railroading is something you haven't come across before and you're interested in that, because it can help with getting your stitches to be a little bit neater, then check out my video all about that. I found that I probably stitched very slightly slower when the fabric was in the hoop compared with stitching in hand. But then this was quite new for me, and again, I think this would be improved if I were using some kind of clamp stand for it. One little advantage to having your fabric in a hoop, if you like to use a needle minder, is also that you can just pop the needle minder onto your fabric in the hoop and it will sit there quite nicely. Now, you may have noticed that I'm stitching what might be considered upside down in the hoop. So I've got mine this way round, and a lot of people would stitch on this side with the fabric flat to the front of the hoop. Now, the reason I like to stitch this way, so I'm stitching in the well or in the ditch, is because then it actually makes it much easier when you come to run threads in on the back, that it's flat and level with the hoop. So yeah, that's just a little tip that I'd come across that does make it a little bit easier when you're running your threads in, when you're using a hoop. One benefit I can see to having your fabric in a hoop or frame while you're stitching is that you're less likely to be touching the fabric and your stitched area while you're stitching, as I would be touching it quite a bit if I was stitching in hand. And that could reduce the risk of getting any dirt or oils from your hands onto the fabric or threads. I make sure to always have clean hands before I sit down to stitch, but there are always invisible oils on your hand that could potentially get onto your fabric or threads and could affect them over time. I never considered this a huge amount before because I would always wash my cross-stitch pieces when I finished them. But I've started to use more hand-dyed threads and hand-dyed fabric that you can't wash when you're finished. So that aspect of cleanliness has perhaps become more important to me. Incidentally, if you would like to see how I wash and iron my finished pieces, then I have a video that goes through step by step exactly how I like to do that. So to bring all of that together with my final thoughts, I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed stitching with my fabric in a hoop, and I never thought I would say that. And I suspect with the addition of a clamp stand to hold the hoop, I'd probably find it even better. However, the benefits over stitching in hand actually weren't really there. Although I enjoyed using it, it didn't make my stitching any quicker or neater, and it didn't make it a huge amount easier. So I'm then using a whole lot of equipment for what is for me a really marginal benefit. And that feels a little bit unnecessary. It's also certainly less portable than stitching in hand. So in the end, I'm just not sure it's really worth it for me. Although I would give it a go potentially with a clamp stand in the future so that I could try two-handed stitching, because I've been quite interested to try that out, as it can potentially increase the speed of your stitching. And as the name suggests, you do need both hands free for that. So I would need my stitching in a hoop and attached to a clamp stand. Now, if I did decide to use a hoop again in future, I would definitely be using one of these Nurge hoops again, because I found them so much nicer than a wooden embroidery hoop or the plastic snap frames such as the Q-snaps. I find with a wooden embroidery hoop, the fabric can slip more easily when you're using it. And for the snap frames, I just find them a bit more fiddly to get the fabric into the right place, and they're also a bit bulkier and even more awkward to hold, I find, although I know a lot of people really love them. And again, I guess if I put that on a clamp stand, it wouldn't be a problem. As with all things cross-stitch, there's never a right or a wrong way to do things. It only matters that you find the way that you like to do things best. But of course, I am curious. How do you like to do your stitching? Do you like a hoop? A scroll frame perhaps? Have you been converted from stitching in hand to a hoop, or the other way round? As I say, drop me a comment and let me know. If you found this video interesting or helpful, then do give it a thumbs up, and I'd love for you to subscribe so you can stay in the loop for all the stitchy tips and tutorials that I have planned. Plus, you can also find my floss tube videos, which are my informal chats every couple of weeks, sharing what I've been working on. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching!